Story 1. The original Oregon Trail on my elementary school's Apple IIE captivated me, although I frequently succumbed to dysentery. Story 2. Technically, my first game was The Legend of Zelda on my grandma's NES. I had seen my cousins playing Super Mario Bros. And thought that machine was just for Mario. So when I turned it on while The Legend of Zelda was inserted, I was met with something very different. This was back when I was 3, and I did not absorb anything from that at the time. The first game I vividly remember playing was Sonic Advance for the Game Boy Advance. Story 3. I have a very brief memory of playing putt-putt and joining the circus with my older brother when I was around 3 years old. My first real memory is playing Pokemon Gold. Story 4. If NES games are included, I assume something like Battle Tanks or Lode Runner. On PC before Windows it was Paperboy. On Windows it was The Lion King. Story 5. I played a mix of arcade games from stores that I can't remember anymore, but I consider the first real game I ever played to be either Double Dragon or Contra on my dad's old Nintendo Entertainment System. The first computer game I played was called Snoopy vs. the Red Baron, where you played as Snoopy and flew a Sopwith camel on various missions in cartoonish battlefields. It was enjoyable because there were several themed worlds, similar to those in Mario. You accessed them by flying into a billboard, and the baseball field served as a hub world where Pigpen had a garage to upgrade your plane and buy new weapons like a water balloon launcher or a potato gun. My personal favorite weapon was the flaming boomerang, which would ricochet off multiple opponents before returning to your plane. Story 6. My first game was either Super Mario 64 or Tarzan on the PlayStation 1. I don't know which. I remember playing both when I was around the same age. Story 7. The original Spyro the Dragon was a game my mom bought to keep me occupied while she worked from home. Little did she know I would spend the next month obsessively collecting every single gem. That purple dragon was my childhood best friend. Story 8. I'm not entirely sure what the game was called, but it was on the Atari 2600 and was something like ping pong. Story 9. I can't remember the exact name, but I recall it had something to do with the Battle of Antietam. You would place troops along the battlefield and try to attack or defend. It was very basic since it was back in the DOS days and I was quite young. I must have played it around 1991. I actually just found it on Archive. This game is likely why I was one of the few people in my entire school who was able to use computers, and I was only in first grade. Story 10. Spyro, Year of the Dragon on the first PlayStation really bonded my older siblings and me. Story 11. In the mid-90s, I had a knockoff home console with a variety of games preloaded onto it called a TV Boy. It featured different NES games, including Dr. Mario, Duck Hunt, and Donkey Kong, among others I can't recall. I specifically remember that the Super Mario game was split into parts, allowing you to choose which world to start from. Additionally, Donkey Kong was misspelled as Donkey Dong, which I found pretty funny when I last played it in the late 2000s. Story 12. I'd say either Duck Hunt or Dave, followed by Prince of Persia, Contra, and Mario. Do you remember those cassettes with 999, 9999 in one games? Story 13. Honestly, Lego Avengers, I am new to this, but I remember playing it when I was around 3 years old. This was the first one, by the way. Story 14. My cousin got a Philips Videopoc computer, which is a Magnavox Odyssey in Europe. We played an Indiana Jones-inspired game where you had to catch monkeys, but when they turned red, they became dangerous. Unfortunately, my cousin had a black and white TV, so it didn't work very well. Story 15. Duck Hunt. My dad used the saying, "Don't sit too close to the TV. It will make you blind," to motivate me to improve my shooting from a distance. Story 16. Microsoft Solitaire is one of the first fun games I played, along with something like Pokemon Yellow. Story 17. I believe it was Sonic the Hedgehog. I remember my first system being the Sega Genesis. Honestly, it could have even been one of those great Disney games for the Genesis as well. I remember being around 5 years old and playing The Lion King on vacation. Story 18. It was Super Mario Bros. Or Duck Hunt, but I can't remember which. It's a bit hazy because I was 5. What I do remember clearly is that Platoon and Ninja Gaiden weren't far behind. Did anyone ever play Platoon on the Nintendo Entertainment System? That game was very challenging for a 5-year-old. Story 19. Duke Nukem 3D was 4 years older than me, but it was the only game we had on our computer back then. I was too young for this game and ended up breaking my only keyboard at that time. Years later, I still love this game. Story 20. I don't remember, but I was a little toddler sitting behind the counter of my grandpa's computer store when computers were first introduced to the market for widespread consumption. It was probably Pong or Snake or something similar. Story 21. Prince of Persia for DOS was a challenging game, and I still love Master of Orion 1. Story 22. It was either Super Mario for the Nintendo DS, Club Penguin, or an early 2000s racing game I can't remember the name of. It might have been a Need for Speed or a Hot Wheels game. All I remember from it is a super long drop in one of the courses. Story 23. Pokemon Crystal had a broken save feature, but I was too young to realize that was a problem. I thought it was intentional that it reset every time my Game Boy died. So, I began trying to complete the whole game before my Game Boy would die, essentially starting to speedrun Pokemon. I was 8 years old. Story 24. When I was 4 years old, my dad handed me his gray Game Boy with The Legend of Zelda, Link's Awakening, to keep me occupied while he took a bathroom break. Soon after, he got me the little ice blue Game Boy with Bugs Bunny in Crazy Castle and Milo's Secret Castle, followed by Runes of Ultima and Final Fantasy Legends. Once I could read a bit better, it all started with a bathroom break. Story 25. Marbles, Tiddlywinks, and Hopscotch were popular games before the era of electronics. As for computer games, Nibbles and Gorilla were among the early favorites. Story 26. Maybe this Sonic 2 handheld by Tiger Games from 1992, or Tetris on the original Game Boy. Story 27. I want to mention Duck Hunt. I remember getting a Nintendo Entertainment System as a child. We had the Mario and Duck Hunt cartridge. I definitely would have tried that first because of the bright orange gun. Story 28. The oldest game I can remember is Pac-Man on the PlayStation 1, possibly Pac-Man World. I was about 3 or 4 years old, so I cannot clearly recall what was happening. Story 29. There are many fellow Pong enthusiasts here. Although I had the British version in the early to mid-1970s, it was TV Tennis, possibly by Binatone. Story 30. Commodore 64 games include Oregon Trail, Fantastic Four, Pong, and Space Invaders. The first game that got me hooked was Final Fantasy for Nintendo. Story 31. As a very young child with older siblings, my first game was Resident Evil 2. I constantly died at the very first zombie and eventually gave up. The second game, and the first at which I was any good, was Final Fantasy VIII. I was about 4 years old and got pretty far since I watched my siblings play it, so I kind of knew what to press to make Squall hit things. However, I did not have the attention span to finish the whole game. Honestly, that last part still holds true in a sense. So many trophy hunts abandoned at 90%. Story 32. I don't even remember. I know it was something for Super Nintendo because my older brother got a Super Nintendo when I was a baby. Story 33. My earliest memory of a game was Sonic the Hedgehog, the first one. Though my parents had an Atari, there is a chance I might have played something on that, but I don't remember. Story 34. I think it was Aladdin on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. I remember a level that starts with a trampoline to reach a great height, and my parents had to help me with the jump. Everything began from there. Story 35. My earliest memory of gaming goes back to playing Ultima 4 on the Macintosh 128K. My first gaming console was an Atari 2600. Story 36. Super Mario Sunshine or Dragon Ball Z. Budokai on GameCube. I can't remember which one was first, but I had them at the same time. Story 37. Grand Theft Auto, the first one on PlayStation 1. I have a vague memory of running around and doing terribly when I was about 6 years old. I then got into the Nintendo Wii, and later on Minecraft on Kindle Fire and then the console edition. Story 38. Memories are a little blurry because I was very young, but if I remember correctly, it was Double Dragon 2 on the original Game Boy. It was not a great game, but it was good enough that I spent a considerable amount of time on it back then. I tried to play it again a few months ago, and I didn't even last 20 minutes. Video games have certainly come a long way. Story 39. It was a top-down space shooter, but I don't know the name. I played it with my mom between 1994 and 1996. Some ships had a British flag on top, I think. I would love to know what the game was called. Story 40. NHL 2000 on PC. My brothers won it in a raffle, and it was simple enough for me to try as a 4-year-old who grew up at hockey rinks. Story 41. It was either a Pokemon game on the Game Boy or the first Halo. I really can't remember which one exactly, as it was around 2005. Story 42. I hope someone knows this game because I was about 5 and don't remember the name, but I recall the scenery. The game was in 3D, similar to the style of Elden Ring. I had massive weapons, and at the time, I was in a canyon-like area fighting enemies and giant monsters or animals. Story 43. Like on a console? Mario. Well, technically, I had a Tetris game since I'm from Russia. That was our first handheld console, and we had Tetris on it. Before video games, I played chess, checkers, and cards. Story 44. I think it was Vampirjacked. My father showed me that game. I don't know if there is an English version of it, but you basically needed to shoot vampires with these pointy wooden stakes. Story 45. I think it was Ratchet and Clank 2 for the PlayStation 3 that my father had at that time. Then I played Prototype and my journey began. Story 46. GoldenEye on Nintendo 64 was an incredible experience for 4-year-old me. Gameplay aside, I could not believe I could control what happened on the TV. Story 47. An old Atari 2600 game called Combat had different levels. Sometimes you controlled a tank and sometimes a plane. It was pretty cool until I beat both of my older cousins, and then they stopped playing with me. Story 48. Very much a niche game. I got a Game Boy Pocket and the Jungle Book game when I was 4 or 5, and my mom and I have never been able to finish the first level to this day. Story 49. Not 100% sure, but it almost certainly would have been Super Mario Bros. That came with the original Nintendo Entertainment System, since that was my brother's first system when we were younger than 10 years old. Story 50. It has been a while. It was either the original Star Wars arcade game, the sit-down version where you fly a wireframe Death Star trench run, or Asteroids for the Atari 2600. Research indicates that the arcade game was released a couple of years before we acquired the Atari, when I was around 4 or 5 years old. However, since we lived in a rural area, I cannot say for certain how old I was the first time I actually played in an arcade. Story 51. Hybrid Heaven. I was born in 1996, so I was about 4 years old when I played it and had no idea what was happening. I would always get halfway through, after the Tyrannosaurus Rex chases you, and then the game became unbelievably difficult for a child like me. Story 52. The first game I remember is Bases Loaded on the Nintendo Entertainment System, probably around 1993 or 1994, playing with my dad. Story 53. 4-home, Binatone TV Tennis, which was effectively a Pong clone. For Arcade Battlezone, which was a vector graphic tank game. Story 54. I think it was either Duck Hunt or World Class Track Meet. I know I started playing Super Mario Bros. Later that same day. Oh, and Little Nemo, the Dream Master. I loved that game, but I never made it very far. Story 55. Road Rash and Dyna Blaster. I used to sneak off from school to play them. I did poorly in exams because of it, but it was totally worth it. Story 56. The first game? Probably one of the Tonka Truck games, or maybe a putt-putt game with that little purple car. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.